Alright, so welcome to the video on the COVID-19 virus. Today what we're going to do is we're going to go through some of what the scientific literature is saying. Before we dive in, I just want to do a quick disclaimer. Some of the scientific literature that we're referencing here is something called preprint. So because of the rigorous scientific method and what it takes to get scientific literature published, a lot of the stuff coming out on COVID-19 isn't necessarily going through the full peer review process just because of that, I'm going to say, hunger for information on that virus and that need to know as much information as we can as quickly as possible. So, like I said, some of the stuff is preprint, so it's taken from scientific experiments that have been written up, but instead of the full peer review process, they've been kind of sped through. So that some of our research here does depend on that. Some of it is peer reviewed. As always, everything said is from a scientific article for this specific video. I have all the references at the end, and we'll go through them quickly once we're through kind of everything we have to talk about. All right, so let's jump on in. All right, so what is novel coronavirus 19 or nCoV-19? So it belongs to a family of viruses known as coronaviruses. This family also includes the SARS virus, the severe acute respiratory syndrome, and MERS virus, the Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome. So it's considered the third highly pathogenic coronavirus to appear in the last 2 decades. So that's alongside SARS and MERS, which we just talked about. For anyone else here in Canada, you'll remember SARS. It hit Toronto a while back. We're going to come back to these two viruses and compare it to COVID-19 in a little bit. So early fatality rates appear between 0.6% to 3.5% of cases. One thing to really understand is that this is changing daily, and it may differ due to location. That's why we see the range here. So you might see that fatality rates in China may differ from fatality rates in Italy, and that even may differ by time. So a good way to better understand this, I put up an intro to epidemiology video that goes into mortality, case fatality rates, and really kind of peels back the layers to these numbers. If you haven't checked that out, go check that out. And then, yeah, it'll just give you a little bit of a better understanding of this. It's theorized that coronavirus COVID-19 can proliferate at any time of year. Currently, the immunity to the virus is unknown once it's contracted. We assume that there's some sort of immunity, but we don't know to what extent. So we don't know if it's short-term immunity, if it's long-term immunity. We're trying to look at other coronaviruses to get a better understanding of this. But at this point in time, we just don't know. So as for the structure of COVID-19, what we know is it's a single-strand RNA coronavirus that enters our cells by binding to an enzyme that is present in our lungs, vascular endothelium, and cardiac myocytes. So it binds to our lungs, arteries, veins, and then our cardiac muscle. And then below, this is a picture of a coronavirus. Okay, so now let's look at the progression of the COVID-19 disease. So what we know, there's an asymptomatic period of infection, so a period of time where you don't display any symptoms for 5 days on average, but this period of time ranges from 2 days to 14 days. So one thing to note here is in this asymptomatic period, this incubation period, you are still contagious to other people. This is different from SARS, and we're going to talk about this in a little bit more detail later on, but just as like a broad overview, that's why SARS was easier to contain. COVID-19, you're walking around for 5 days without knowing that you have it, which means that you're contagious to everyone that you bump into. After this 5 days on average incubation period, there's an average of an 8-day onset before you start to feel breathlessness. There's a 9-day average until ARDS is experienced, so acute respiratory distress syndrome, and then 10.5 days until ICU admission in severe cases. So one thing to know is that this isn't like a guarantee. You're not guaranteed to feel breathlessness. You're not guaranteed to get acute respiratory distress syndrome or end up in ICU. This is just from the people that experience those things. This is what they're noticing. Some people go through the entire disease progression, staying in the asymptomatic period. It doesn't feel like they're sick. Other people end up in the ICU and on ventilators. One other thing to note, the virus can survive on surfaces for anywhere between 24 to 72 hours, so 1 to 3 days, and this depends on the type of surface that virus is on. Talking about the symptoms, so the most common symptoms that are experienced by people are fever. So 83% of people with COVID-19 will experience fever, 82% will experience a cough, and 31% will experience breathlessness. Other symptoms include headaches, body aches, diarrhea, and fatigue. Another thing that's important is at this time, for example, a couple days ago, the CDC just released, I think, another 6 symptoms of COVID-19. So the important thing, and something I'll keep stressing over and over again, is that more information is coming out daily on COVID-19. So this is by no means a comprehensive list of symptoms. Always refer back to your public health agencies, their websites, your health professionals for that comprehensive list. And if you think you have any symptoms, obviously contact a medical professional, your hospital, clinic. This is just what the scientific literature said at the time. And again, scientific literature takes time to come out. So there is a bit of lag of what is presented here and what is going on in the scientific world. Going back to that structure of COVID-19, so we said it's a single-stranded RNA virus, but digging a little deeper, so it shares 88% of its genetic sequence to 2 other coronaviruses that are found in bats. So that's led us to think that this virus originated in a bat. When we compare it to other viruses in the family of coronaviruses, we see here that it shares 79% of its genetic sequence to severe acute respiratory syndrome, so SARS, and then 50% of its genetic sequence to Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome, so MERS, both of these which we talked about earlier. Okay, so with COVID-19 being part of a broader family of coronaviruses, we should take a look at what we know about these other coronaviruses, especially given the similarities in genetic sequencing, and see if we can take what we know about those viruses and see if there's any shared commonalities between that and COVID-19. So just what we know about other coronaviruses, these 2 here, HCOVID 0C43 and HCOVID HKU1. So these are not the same as the bat coronaviruses that we discussed earlier. These are human coronaviruses, and they're the most common causes of the common cold. And after we get them, the immunity we gain from having these viruses typically lasts 1 year. So that's how you end up getting the cold every year. The immunity eventually wanes and you don't have it anymore. So the SARS epidemic appeared in 2002 and MERS appeared in 2012. So these are important because they were easier to control rather than COVID, which, as we've seen, has gone worldwide, because of that asymptomatic incubation period. So we talked about this a little earlier. In COVID, it's a 5-day incubation period. That was different for SARS and MERS. But the big difference here is that they were not contagious during their asymptomatic incubation period, unlike COVID-19. So COVID-19, you can pass it on while not showing signs and symptoms, and SARS and MERS, you couldn't. So public health was able to do contact tracing. If there was a chance that you had the disease and you got tested and it was positive, what they did was you were isolated, you're quarantined for the entire progression of the disease. And then by isolating you that way, they were able to kind of squash those diseases out. With COVID-19, as soon as you feel symptoms and you're like, oh, I might have this disease, it's too late. You've already passed it on to people. That's why they've been trying to do such aggressive contact tracing, and that's why they were pleading with people, if you were in contact with someone, even though you don't feel sick, please isolate, because it is infectious during this incubation period. All right, so in this slide, we're just kind of comparing COVID-19 to SARS, MERS, and H1N1. Before we dive into the numbers, what you'll see is that there's a couple blanks in the H1N1 row. This is because the scientific literature that that I took this chart from didn't have information in there. I don't think they were confident in the information that they had, so they didn't put it in, which is safe practice. So just going through this, we'll go from top to bottom. So starting with SARS, so it originated in China during 2002-2003. There was a total of 8,422 cases, 916 deaths with 11% case fatality. The R naught number, so the reproductive number, was 2 to 4. So what this means is that for every person infected with SARS, they passed it on to anywhere between 2 to 4 people. And the number of countries affected was 29. When we compare that to MERS, so that originated in Saudi Arabia in 2012. There was approximately 2,500 cases with 858 deaths with a case fatality of 34.4%, with that reproductive number of 1. So for every person with MERS, they passed it on to one other person. And this affected 27 countries. So now when we look at COVID-19, originated in Wuhan, China. So it started last year, 2019. And as of February 24th, there's approximately 80,000 cases worldwide. So this had led to 2,618 deaths and a case fatality rate of approximately 1 to 2%, with a reproductive number of 2.2. And the number of affected countries at that time was 29. Like I said, there is a lag between scientific literature and the present moment. So these numbers obviously have changed. So again, I kind of throw caution to the wind when we look at numbers for COVID-19, just because of the rigors of testing, the total fatality, like the case fatality rate and the number of deaths. It's really hard to get these accurate numbers in the time of the pandemic going on. So we probably won't have accurate numbers until much later to really be able to compare these. The reason I say that is even just recently, we saw that China released corrected number of deaths, and we saw their number of deaths go up by 50%. So like I said, it takes some time. There's always lag in reporting. So we have to be real hesitant in really looking at these numbers. But I just thought this was interesting to include so that we can compare SARS and MERS and kind of get an idea of where we're at with COVID, where it might go, where it might not go, depending on protective measures put into place. So some of the risks of COVID-19. So first of all, anyone can get COVID-19. As far as we know right now, there's no one that's protected against it. We don't have a vaccine. Like I said earlier, we don't really know the immunity associated with COVID-19. There's the scientific literature didn't really speak on that. It spoke about the possibilities of the different types, but not what we know about the immunity. So anyone can get COVID-19. In terms of risks of COVID-19, what this is talking about is the risk of severity for the disease. So being more at risk of ending up in the ICU, having more severe symptoms. Age is the first risk factor. So the older you are, the more at risk you are of developing more severe COVID-19. If you're immunosuppressed or immunocompromised, again, risks of COVID-19 are increased. And then comorbidities. So things like heart disease, diabetes, obesity, these are all comorbidities and increase your risk of severity of COVID-19. All right, so this slide here is talking about thrombotic complications. So complications involving clots. And recently there's been evidence that COVID-19 patients in ICU are experiencing a higher prevalence of clots and thrombotic events than other ICU patients. So you're already at risk being in the ICU for a thrombotic complication, but they're finding that COVID-19 patients are having these occur more often than other ICU patients. So one study in China saw that of 81 patients with severe COVID-19 in an ICU, 20 of them, or 25%, developed venous thromboembolism. In a different study of 3 Dutch centers, 31% of ICU patients with COVID-19 developed thrombotic complications. So we are seeing clots being more apparent in COVID-19. And lately I've been seeing a lot of things surface about blood complications, especially in the younger populations. And I believe the CDC just released some more information on this. All right, so now we're going to look at the scientific literature that tried to forecast COVID-19. So what they tried to do was look at the different scenarios that could take place, the different properties that COVID-19 could display in terms of even like the immunity that we could gain from it. And they tried to forecast what our future will look like with this disease. And I just thought it was very interesting to see what we might be in for in the near future. Okay, so in this slide, we're going to talk about the different scenarios of induced immunity. So once you get COVID-19, what kind of an immunity do you attain? And depending on what type of immunity we get from COVID-19 will determine how it progresses. For example, if immunity is not permanent, so if we get short-term immunity, which will last typically approximately 40 weeks, so this is like the common cold, we could see annual outbreaks of COVID-19. Longer term immunity, so something that looks upon a duration of about 2 years. So we're looking at biennial outbreaks. So every 2 years we could see outbreaks. If immunity is permanent, we could see this virus disappear for upwards of 5 or more years. So along with that, if immunity is permanent and the virus disappears for 5+ years, we could also see a decline in other beta coronaviruses. So like those human coronaviruses that we talked about earlier that cause a common cold, we might see those decline as well. This would require 70% of cross immunity. So cross immunity, what that is that if you get one strain of a pathogen or a virus, you might get some immunity to other viruses that are similar in genetic sequence. So with 70% cross immunity between COVID and these other beta coronaviruses, we could see those go away for a long time. Cross immunity, though, from other beta coronaviruses could give us the false illusion that COVID-19 has died out, only for it to come back a few years later. So this occurs with 30% cross immunity. So as you can see, there's good and bad. We could go under this false illusion. COVID-19's gone away forever, lower our guard just for it to come back and wreak havoc. So hopefully there is that 70% cross immunity that will affect other beta coronaviruses as well. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the different scenarios based on the type of social distancing measures that we have in place. This is kind of a hot topic right now, especially with provinces in Canada or countries around the world talking about reopening their economy. I just want to make it very clear. Once again, we're not talking about economic implications here. We're just talking about the effect of the social distancing measures. I'm in no way displaying an opinion on these matters. This is directly from the scientific literature. Just want to make that very clear. Okay, so if we implement one-time social distancing measures, so we've put social distancing in place now, and say that we start to reopen the economy and we don't implement any social distance measures going on, what's likely to happen is that overall epidemic peak size has reduced, but we're going to see resurgences occur upon lifting of the measure. So for example, if a country is in lockdown and then they lift those measures, without re-implementing some form of social distancing or doing it properly, they're going to see COVID-19 resurge upon those measures being lifted. Intermittent social distancing measures, this requires a great deal of testing and contact tracing to ensure that it's properly going to work, but it showed promise to protect critical care capacity, which has always been one of the main concerns with this COVID virus. So this talks about implementation of a range of 25 to 70% of social distancing measures. So essentially, this is what's referred to as there's a threshold put in place. So for example, if we say 200 new daily cases, if we fall below that, we can relax on some social distancing measures. We can go down to 25% of what we're implementing now. If we go above 200, then we implement more social distancing measures, and it's kind of free flowing. So As cases reduce, we relax our social distancing measures. As the cases go up, we make them strict again. So it kind of follows a bit of a wave pattern. And this has shown pretty good promise to protecting our critical care capacity, which is why social distancing measures were putting in the first place. We really didn't want to see our hospitals and healthcare systems get overwhelmed. And this is one of the ways that we can really properly protect that capacity. Okay, so in this slide, the study that talked about social distancing measures, so it referred to South Korea as a successful process. So when we look at what South Korea did, they put in measures relatively successfully. Unfortunately, though, we won't really know exactly how successful anything is until we're all over this and we can analyze it from kind of in hindsight. Right now, we're still in the thick of things. This graphic here, what I wanted to display is what the importance of the measures that we put into place. So as we see here, without protective measures, we would overwhelm the healthcare system capacity. We could potentially see a lot more deaths, both of COVID, but also of non-COVID related issues. So for example, if we overwhelm healthcare, if you got into a car accident, you needed medical attention and you went into the hospital, the beds might be so filled with COVID patients that you won't be seen in time and could die from the car crash. That's what without protective measures, that's why it's so scary. With protective measures in place, as you can see, the time elapsed of the pandemic is stretched, but we stay below that healthcare system capacity. So we wouldn't see as much of a disastrous outcome. So we might be able to handle everything that's coming at us. In that research article that talked about social distancing measures, it seemed to allude that the intermittent social distancing measures seem to work more adequately. We don't want to see a resurgence of COVID-19. So by having a free-flowing state of social distancing measures, we can keep our healthcare system capacity, I guess, in the proper area. So we won't overwhelm it. At the same time, with that free-flowing social distancing measures, we can also open up parts of the economy and kind of limit the devastating effects of that. All right, so as we near the end of this presentation, I just want to put in a little bit of my own opinion about going forward, how to kind of look at stuff moving forward. This isn't going to be talking about whether or not we should open up the economy, whether or not we should be waiting for a vaccine or mass vaccinations or any of those hot topics, basically because I think that that's a discussion for someone who knows absolutely everything about those areas. I do not claim to know that stuff. There's a lot that goes on in this. So it's very hard to just come up with these solutions by yourself. That's why you see all these people in massive teams sitting at tables talking about this stuff with all the information at their fingertips. Okay, so first thing I want to talk about is trusting in our professionals. I know it seems like the cool thing to do to look at what we're being told and say, no, we're not going to listen to it. They're just in it for their own interests. But a lot of these people, especially the public health experts, they've been training their lives learning about this stuff and really understanding what's going on and trying to figure out the best way to tackle this. Just like me and you, this is probably one of the first times they're dealing with something of this magnitude. So I think with all of us being human, we have to give them room to make mistakes. They're trying just as hard as anyone else. So let's trust in our professionals. Another thing I want to say is be cynical of what you read on social media. Social media lets anyone post anything they want. So it could be anything from like some pretty insane conspiracy theories to false information and misrepresented numbers, to someone who's sitting in their basement calculating their own COVID model of how this is going to happen, and then releasing it saying that this is exactly what's going to happen and presenting it in a professional way. Always be cynical of what you see on social media. Always try and fact check, question. If someone typically responds to you questioning in a polite way with insults, that usually raises a red flag. But always think, okay, does this make sense? Is this true? If it's not, try to look for backup material, backup resources that say the same thing that what you're reading is saying. Um, Another thing to really understand is that forecasting models are like weather forecasts. They're trying to predict what could happen and help us prepare for what could happen, and they try to help influence public policy, but it is in no means 100% accurate, and nor do they claim to be 100% accurate. For example, when countries release their forecast modeling, they're just saying, okay, this is what could happen. We hope it doesn't happen, and this is what we're going to do to try and prevent it. The reason I included this is because I see a lot of people who will post things and say, oh, they said we're supposed to have 100,000 deaths in this country by next week, and we only have 1,000. They don't know what they're talking about. That's not true. The reason that's not true is because their forecast modeling was saying in the worst case scenario, this could happen. In the best case scenario, this could happen if we didn't implement anything or if we implemented some sort of protective measures. There's a lot that goes into these models, a lot of variables. The fact that we're below those numbers is a good thing. It doesn't mean that they were absolutely wrong. They don't know what they're talking about. It means the measures that we put into place are working. So try not to be so harsh on those forecasting models. Okay, so just a couple things about when looking at the media. So the most important thing is try to decipher fact from opinion. A lot of things that get put out, they'll display some facts and then they'll introduce some opinion into it. Everything is, I guess, vulnerable to this. Even scientific literature is vulnerable to this, especially when you just go straight to the discussion or the conclusions. A lot of the time, it's just natural. Humans will put in their biases, they'll put in their opinions. Try to look at the facts and make your own decisions from that. That kind of goes on to the next point of rely on the numbers and the graphs instead of the interpretation of reporters. So when they present numbers, look at the numbers for what they are. So if, for example, I'm going to go back to the Intro to Epidemiology movie or video. If they present total number of deaths in two countries, try to realize that they might not be comparable, especially if they're comparing deaths in a small country to a large country. Just kind of take the numbers for what they are. They're just presenting how many people died in those countries. It doesn't mean anything in terms of which country is doing better or which country is doing worse. Epidemiologists have different numbers for that, regardless of what the reporters will try to say or interject with. And then the last point on this slide, if you don't understand what is being said in a news article or a post and it just seems to go along with what you believe, just don't share the post. It might not be telling you the right information. I mean, this is dangerous, especially when I'm going to say, as a society, as a culture, we're so close to getting over that peak of the pandemic. Misinformation can easily send us shooting way back to the beginning of the pandemic and a resurgence. So just be careful what you share on social media. Try and be responsible with it. And most importantly, have calm, open discussions regarding what you've read. This is how we learn. It doesn't matter what the other person you're talking to, what stance they have. If you're both talking about it and you're both calm, you both can learn something from the discussion. You might learn a fact that you didn't know. They might learn a fact that they didn't know, and then you can come to conclusions together. One of the things I look for when I'm having discussions, if someone gets insulting, vulgar, or verbally abusive during that argument, that usually tells me that the discussion is over, and I don't pursue it any further. That's because at that point, you're not going to change anyone else's mind. You're better off just sticking with the facts that you know, as long as you're being responsible about your data collection, and you're doing what you can to talk to others without forcing your opinion on them. Rather, just teach them what you know. That'll go a lot longer of a way. And then lastly, stay safe, practice good hygiene and proper social distancing. I know with the good weather coming up, it's really hard to stay away from everyone. I mean, I know I'm missing some of the sports that I do, some of the activities I do. I can't do them right now because of social distancing, because of, they've closed parks, they've closed gyms, they've closed all that kind of stuff. But in the long run, it's better for everyone. It's safer for everyone. We're doing what we have to do, and if we can all get behind it and do this stuff together, practice our good hygiene, social distancing, we'll get through this, and we'll come out stronger for it. And lastly, we will get through this. I know the news, like all the media, social media, everyone likes to put out worst case scenarios. It's what grabs attention. The world's ending, the world's collapsing. We will get through this. I know it's going to seem dark at times, but there is light at the end of the tunnel, especially where we're sitting right now. We can see the top of the peak of the initial outbreak. Even if waves 2 and 3 do come, we'll be prepared for it. We can get through this. All right, and that's it for this presentation. So once again, thanks for listening. I hope you got something out of this. I know it wasn't extremely comprehensive in terms of what we know about COVID-19, just because there is that scientific lag. So a lot of the articles that I did draw information from were from February and early March. I know we're into May now, but I'm just trying to do my best to get out scientific literature and not just stuff that I've heard in the news or on social media. I really want to have everything scientifically referenced. So as you can see here, this is the first page of references. Again, some of these include preprints, which mean not extensively peer-reviewed, but still, given our circumstances, provides us with some pretty good information about COVID-19. And this here's our last couple of references here. So 9 papers in total, covering a broad range of topics. I highly suggest that if you can, give them a read. I enjoyed reading some of these. It opened my eyes to what's actually going on with COVID-19, comparison between SARS and MERS, forecasting where we might be headed. One of the big things that it did say in the forecasting is that we could be at this for 2 years without a vaccine, in certain circumstances. But again, it's so variable on what goes on, how we choose to reopen the countries and go forward, and it depends on us, the general public. If we choose to listen to social distancing measures, if we have good hygiene, if we just act smart, we're going to get through this, and hopefully they can develop a vaccine pretty quickly, and we'll be on the other side of this. So stay safe out there, and we'll see you in the next video.